We're going to switch gears real quick. Similar to Monday and Tuesday, we will conclude today's program with a panel discussion titled Impacts and Importance of Global Trade on Our Business, Communities, and Livelihood. We encourage you to submit questions for the panel in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Our moderator for today's panel will be Mike Estadt, an OSU Extension Educator in Agriculture and Natural Resources in Pickaway County, Ohio. Mike has 31 years of experience with Extension, where his specializations are farm management and agronomy. He serves as a resource for farmland owners, farmers, real estate professionals, and lenders on the topic of rental agreements and farmland values. His teaching has focused on computerized record keeping, business planning, and effective communication for farm business. Mike most enjoys working directly with his clientele on on-farm agronomic research projects. Mike is also serving as the Secretary and Treasurer of the Ohio Farmland and Rural Appraisers Association. With that, please help me welcome Mike Estadt, who will introduce and moderate our panel today. Thanks for being with us, Mike.
Thank you, Ben. Can you hear me okay?
Sure can.
Well, first of all, I don't know if you can tell from the video, I wore my K-State purple today, Ben, as a small tribute to Dr. Barry Flinchbaugh, who we lost recently. So, pleasure to be your moderator today. I'm going to give a brief description, brief bio of our three speakers, and we've divided up, and our speakers have been given a framework of the questions to be prepared. We're going to look at just a little bit about the impact of COVID on international trade, then look at sustainability on international trade, and if we have time, kind of get an outlook of where we see the next 2 to 4 years going with trade. We have with us today Blake Haudan, who serves as a Director of Risk at the Andersons, headquartered in Maumee, Ohio. Mr. Haudan started his career 10 years ago as a wheat trader or in the options pit at the Chicago Board of Trade. From Chicago, he went on to work with Cargill in their animal nutrition business as an associate risk manager. And after Cargill, he joined the Andersons and has had several positions within the company on the cash and futures side for the last 7 years, mainly in the grain division, focused on the soybean product line. Recently, he became the Director of Risk and manages a team of risk managers in the 5 ethanol plants that the Andersons have ownership in. We also have Kirk Merritt. Kirk joined the Ohio Soybean Council in June of 2007 as the International Marketing Director, and also serves as Director for Outreach and Programs for the Ohio Soybean Council Foundation. He was promoted to Executive Director of the Ohio Soybean Council and the Ohio Soybean Council Foundation in December of 2009, and then became the Executive Director of the Ohio Soybean Association in 2017. We also have with us Allison Nepveux, who serves as the Manager of Trade Policy for the U.S. Grains Council, which is a nonprofit organization that promotes the export of corn, barley, sorghum, ethanol, and related co-products. In this role, Allison handles global non-tariff barriers to trade, including issues related to biotechnology, genome editing, and maximum residual levels for crop protection. So in light of time, I would like to go ahead and get started today with our panel discussion. The first set of questions will kind of just serve as an opening statement for each of our speakers, kind of a general question as it relates to the coronavirus pandemic. So I don't know what order who wants to start off, but the first question is, this virus has impacted supply chains around the globe, and we are not all necessarily at the same time. So what impacts do you see to global trade, and specifically within the agricultural industry during the early stages of the virus outbreak? And how have these issues been alleviated? Let's start maybe on a micro version. Let's say, can we ask Blake to lead off with that question?
Absolutely. Thank you, Mike. And thanks for inviting me to join the panel today. Obviously, I believe it was in March when the coronavirus had originally hit. And, from a supply chain standpoint, it's a black swan. I mean, we had multiple fronts where it really hit really hard. Obviously, our ethanol plants with gasoline demand kind of overnight down anywhere from 40 to 60%, and a lot of uncertainty around when it could come back or what things could look like in a week or two. So adjusting those supply chains and adjusting the production and manufacturing around that demand shock is one piece of it, obviously. And then I think the more important thing is just making sure the people at the facilities and the employees are safe. which, we saw from a meat processing side become very, very difficult given their close quarters that they work in. So, there's many, many pieces and many layers. Obviously the first one is employee safety. So having plans around if you do have an outbreak in a facility where you need to load trains or process grain, and having kind of plan A, B, and C if things were to get worse. I would say they were pretty dusty at first, just to be completely candid. And now I feel like, to your main question, are they fixed or alleviated? I think we're in a much better place being prepared for those types of things. And if outbreaks were to happen again on any scale, I think we do have an action plan that is much better and more prepared than we were initially when the virus hit. It might not be completely fixed, but I feel I'm a lot more confident in saying we can handle incidents that would happen at facilities and be able to adapt and keep the supply chain going, as it's obviously important to the food chain and people needing to eat through the virus and being able to have food on the table. So it's stage one, I was, everybody I think was really surprised, but where we're at today, I think we feel a lot more comfortable with the plans in place to be able to adapt and adjust with what the virus can throw at us.
Thanks, Blake. Kirk, looking at the soybean side of the equation, of course, we heard some things out of maybe Argentina, but suppliers that you work with, how they were affected by the COVID pandemic and how they've alleviated some of the bottlenecks.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. Pleasure to be here today and appreciate your work. I'll say a handful of things. Everybody on this call probably aware when you process a soybean, you get two things basically. You get meal and oil. Vast majority of our meal gets sold in the livestock market is part of a animal feed ration. Most of the oil goes into cooking oil, and a big chunk of it goes into biodiesel. So I've just named three markets that were turned upside down as a result of COVID. Fortunately, most of them have made some degree of recovery. But when you look at all three of those, it was extremely disruptive. The good news was farmers, soybean farmers, corn farmers, wheat farmers were able to get the crop in, were able to harvest. The wheat crop obviously just going in, but we're figuring out how to get it done. Soybean harvest, corn harvest is going on. That's the good news. I think another area of positive development is we're beginning to see the livestock markets come back, not to where they were, but in a better way. And I think, specifically talking about exports, the export markets are key to that. I was looking at some of the data. Pork exports year over year are up 15, 16%. So that's helping a lot. You look at the oil market, food service, cooking oil, a lot of the oil that our farmers produce goes into those markets. Food service is beginning to come back, beginning to recover. And biodiesel, the biodiesel market, I won't comment so much on the ethanol. Blake talked about that a little bit earlier. Allison can address that. But for biodiesel, the initial shock was about 20%. It's come back. We're expecting overall for 2020 to be off maybe 8 to 10%. And then just in general, in terms of exports for soybeans, it's hard to overstate how important that is. And it has continued to be a strong part of the equation. China has come back into the market. We've heard earlier from a couple of the speakers, phase one deal is beginning to kick in. So we're beginning to see strength in the export market for beans from China. We've also, Ian asked earlier how are we diversifying, and we're beginning to see some very strong diversification. China continues to be our top market, but you look at a market like Egypt 5 years ago, we weren't selling much to Egypt. It was barely a top 20 market. It's now our third biggest market behind China and Mexico. Similar growth for Bangladesh, Pakistan. So some of these markets that we've sold to for a long time are growing, and then some of them are increasing from a position where they weren't very big. So I'll stop there, but I think some reason for optimism.
Thanks, Kirk. Allison, your view on the initial reaction and working with the U.S. Grains Council on the early stages of the pandemic and how it disrupted.
Thanks, Mike. Well, it's a pleasure to be here, and I'll piggyback off of what Blake and Kirk mentioned. I've had some trouble with my speakers, so we're going to cross our fingers that all goes well. We experienced very similar things to many of the things they alluded to that were happening here domestically, and also maybe for soybean exports overseas. The same things we saw in the U.S. with a lot of pressure on our meat processing supply chain, the shift from eating out to eating at home. All of those things were also happening in our international markets that drastically impacted trade as we knew it. And so we saw, I think, one thing that hasn't been mentioned was a shift not just in where people are consuming protein, but the kinds of protein that they're consuming. So some markets moving a lot more to eggs rather than poultry or pork or beef, which definitely changes the equation when you're supplying feed grains around the world. And to add on top of that, the comments Blake mentioned about ethanol demand, our DDGs are a co-product of ethanol. So some of that also affected our supply. But all of that to be said, we continued to see ports open. We continued to see trade. We continued to have trade. And in some positive ways through all of this, for the Grains Council, our greatest currency has been the ability to share information and to continue to talk about the supply chains that do exist here in the US. And so we've seen that as a real opportunity for us to build on the relationships that we've had overseas. We've seen a transition towards electronic documentation. And so in places where that was accepted and possible, that accelerated that transition to technology. So it's been a disruption. Yes, we've had some significant challenges in the way that we think about our products and where they're going overseas, but we've also seen some very optimistic things that I think will stick around for the long haul. And on the policy side, we had some pretty big challenges on the front end, working government to government and shifting to a virtual environment. But now that we've gone through some of those headaches, I think that there's some structure in place that will allow us to adapt better in the future.
Hey, Mike, you muted yourself.
Okay, I'm sorry. Blake, a company like the Andersons that trades products globally, I'm sure that the pandemic and other things, it doesn't even have to be a pandemic. How do you look at, or the Andersons look at risk management plans in case supply chains stop? And maybe it's not so much related to pandemics and related to health, but what about civil unrest and trade policy? So how does your company set up that risk management plan?
Yeah, so I don't think there's a perfect answer because a lot of times those changes can happen overnight. And I think, just to piggyback on one of the things Allison said about how the pandemic created kind of collaboration and opportunity. So just one example that's we had was with railroads. The railroad situation of precision railroad is being spread across all parts of the U.S. where railroad trains, unit trains show up, and it's turning into an airport model where it shows up at this time and you load it in 12 hours and it goes. There's no flexibility. So in the pandemic with crews and issues, we had an opportunity to work with the railroad and say, listen, we're kind of all in this together. Let's figure this out together so that there isn't that complete stop of a supply chain. So I think going backwards and saying, if we do have this unrest or we have this pandemic that spreads further, where are the pinch points that could shut it down? And working backwards has been our approach as a company, and thinking through the entire supply chain from, the customer or the farmer when we receive the grain to where it needs to get to the end destination, whether it's a flour mill, whether it's a port, what could be those pinch points, whether it's civil unrest, like you said, or it's from the pandemic, from crews and people. One thing I would point out too, when you look at ports in different places, when it hit in March, Brazil was loading out record amounts of soybeans. The Brazil port is very labor intensive. It's trucks mainly, where in the US we're lucky with, the Mississippi River and the barge system that isn't as intensive from a human standpoint or labor. So when you think about Brazil bringing all these trucks from all over the country and people moving through in the middle of a pandemic, that creates a different risk than it would potentially in the US with less people involved and less touch points. So I wanted to provide that example, and that was something that also came up in March is, Brazil's has a huge export program, and if that gets disrupted, you see that slide back to the US, where we need to be prepared for that pickup and what that could mean, and plans, like I said, working backwards to front where the pinch points could be.
Thanks, Blake. Allison, we've heard today, not from Blake and Kirk in this session, but from some of our previous speakers, the idea of picking up new customers. And so what has U.S. Grains Council been kind of strategizing here for the last, say, 7 months on strategies or things to, fill those gaps that we haven't seen before?
One of the things that Blake mentioned was, about our industry in the U.S. not being as labor intensive, I think is a really strong point, and something that, our customers overseas are going to have the right to buy from anyone in the world. So our job is to make sure they know we're at least open for business. And so what we did very early on was to put together videos, to shift to a virtual environment, but to showcase how our supply chain continues to move, how it operates, that the people working in logistics, both in river barge loading and unloading and container shipments, that all of those people were deemed essential, that inspections were still happening, and that our supply chains were still moving. So I think that was a really critical piece for us in the very, very early days of the pandemic, to show to our overseas customers that we are still a reliable source, even in the midst of all of this uncertainty. Our CEO put together an open letter explaining, what our supply chain looks like, and then wrote personal letters to other customers overseas, to other governments. And we found all of that to be really critical in our transition, and just reaffirming that, the relationship we have with our overseas customers is longstanding. And I think it's secured a lot of what the council does as a whole. Having those people on the ground, being able to supply information back to our farmers has been equally critical, just as we've shared information the other way. So that for us has been really pivotal. And again, something that I see continuing, that shift to virtual is going to be important even when we come out on the other side of this.
Thank you. Kirk, the council's worked for a number of years to check off into research and development of other uses of soybeans, and one of those being biodiesel. What did you see as far as in terms of biodiesel related to the pandemic, related to domestic consumption, international biofuel demand? This past week, we've had some people talk about, we had Brent Songen speak about net neutrality on carbon and alternative energy and green energy. So where do you see biodiesel playing in the next few years?
Yeah, thanks, Mike. I think it's clear that biodiesel has a significant role to play as we move forward and we look at the the ideas around carbon reduction and that sort of thing. I mentioned briefly earlier that we did see a dip in biodiesel demand domestically. Initially, it has essentially recovered to trend. It's still going to be off for the year, probably 8 to 10%. But the other factor there is that typically soybean oil is about half of the feedstock for biodiesel, the oil component of that. It's now up to about 70% because there has been some limit in some of the supplies of the other feedstock. So it's extremely important for soybean farmers. Internationally, we're not exporting much biodiesel. Most of what we export goes to Canada, give or take 5% of our production. We'd like to increase that, but it's not a significant part of the equation. But we're optimistic that biodiesel will continue to grow, will continue to benefit soybean farmers going forward.
Thank you, Kurt. Just to switch gears just a little bit about some general impacts on trade, and this is to the panel as a general question. We've seen a lot of changes in the last 20 to 30 years as far as trade. Kind of losing that crystal ball, where do you see us out from 20 years from now as it maybe relates to technology, whether it be things like blockchain, the whole digital ag, companies asking for sustainability reports? Where do you see trade going forward? Someone like it. Kurt, we ended with you. How about we start with you this time?
Happy to. I think a handful of things I'd say to address that, Mike. I think technology is important in many, many ways in terms of production, soybean production, crop production, the genetics and the biotech that goes into the seed, the technology that the farmers use to plant and harvest, the technology that you referred to, some of the more logistics, blockchain, the technology to bring it to market. I think, and you mentioned sustainability. I think sustainability is important now. It's going to be even more important in global markets. Buyers want to know that they're buying a sustainable product, and I think it probably goes without saying to this audience. We think our farmers are already growing sustainably, and sustainable certainly encompasses environmental and stewardship aspects, but it also has to be profitable, and the farm needs to be sustainable from generation to generation. One thing that our national level export group has done, U.S. Soybean Export Council, the counterpart to Allison's group, has done is to implement a Soy Sustainability Protocol, so that they have a series of factors that they audit soy production on, and then they can go to the international market and say, this soy has been raised sustainably. For the most part, those are factors that farmers are already doing. Farmers are good environmental stewards. They want to take care of the land. So that's an advantage for us over some of our competitors to be able to go to the market with that sort of sustainability pledge, if you will.
I'd like to open it up to either Allison or Blake. I guess my end of it, I work with the people that are ground zero. What's it going to take to influence the farmer to get him to do it? It's hard. It's one thing to say we're going to have a blockchain technology. It's another thing to do. How do you think the incentive is going to be out there? Go ahead, Blake.
Allison, I don't know if you want to. Okay, I'll go first. Yep. Yeah. I mean, I think there's a lot of pieces to that question. The farmer, obviously, it's a business. I mean, it's a family business to them, and you need to tell the story and explain to them the long-term benefits. Like Kirk said, I can tell you in the last 6 to 12 months, from a sustainability standpoint, the questions and paperwork and pieces we're getting from end users is greater than the last 5 to 7 years before that. So the trend is very clear, in my opinion. And I think making sure that farmers understand that story, and like Kirk said, they care about the land, obviously, it's important to them. They're already doing it. Making sure that they understand the bigger picture and the bigger story so they can help get us there quicker is only going to benefit them. I guess I don't see, I can see where it can be slow to get it to go, but I think their benefits to going there and getting there because they're already doing it are clear, like Kirk said. So, but yeah, that would be kind of how I see it.
Yeah, so I would, I'll just add to that. I mean, I think that both Kirk and Blake talked a lot about the farmer side of the equation and the adoption of technology. And I do think the environment we're in now has accelerated the pace towards sustainability. It's no longer a nice to have, it's a must have, it's a cost of doing business. I think that changes part of the equation. But on the other side, there's opportunities for technologies within the supply chain itself. And we've seen a lot more digitizing trade documents and using blockchain, not just, for traceability all the way back to the farm, but for holding people accountable along the entire system. I think that too is going to stick around. So it's not just the farm side of the equation. I think that businesses as a whole are recognizing a need to come out of the paperwork era, to find more digital solutions in a time when we want less contact, but still to maintain trade with our partners.
Okay, Allison, can I follow up? Many believe that trade is a zero-sum game, that where someone must lose for others to benefit. So, where is U.S. Grains Council? How are you kind of balancing that, and how have you increased the welfare of both U.S. producers and consumers around the globe as trying to find out how to create that balance with trade and your trade partners?
I think that's a great question. We spend a lot of time on trade education and the importance of trade, explaining that it's not a zero-sum game. I think a really great example of that in the very early days of the council, long before my time, we started doing a lot of work in North Asia, so markets like Japan and Korea, and developing their livestock industries in turn created an environment for us to sell our products to them. So both partners are really winning, and we've seen that time and time again. We've seen that in North Asia originally, in North Africa. Now we're seeing a lot of opportunity in Southeast Asia, in other parts of Africa, in India. So I do think that there's, part of this equation is making sure that, a lot of the work the council does is developing those markets overseas. And the other part of that is making sure that we continue to be a reliable, safe, high quality provider of those products. So it also requires a lot of attention to our own logistics, our own supply chain. All of that works hand in hand so that we have markets to sell to. As incomes rise and there's more and more demand for proteins around the world, we have an opportunity to bring a lot of people out of poverty, a lot of people out of malnutrition, and also to have markets for our farmers to sell to.
Thank you. Kurt, I want to switch it over to you a little bit. Quite often right now, soybean growers in Ohio, they dump their beans in the pit there at the elevator and they don't really think much about it after that. I think here the last few years, we realize how important China is and that a lot of our beans go to China. But what is the council doing to help farmers think a little bit more about how many other people down the chain are involved in our marketing of soybeans in Ohio?
It's hard to overstate the importance of the international market for soybean farmers. When you include meal and oil along with whole bean exports, about 60% of our crop gets exported every year. It was as high as 2/3 before the recent trade tensions, but still extremely significant. So we do everything we can to make sure that farmers are aware of that. Very, very few farmers are going to sell directly to a buyer in Japan or a buyer in Egypt, but their beans end up there. And every other row, a little more than every other row, it ends up on a boat one way or another. I think to the extent that we all can make sure that there is a high level of awareness of that, I think that's really positive for the industry and for the entire value chain. That farmers understand that the folks who are involved in our industry overall are aware of that. I think it's extremely important. And the fact that, soybean farmers indirectly export a lot of beans, not even included in that 60% number, is the beans that are fed to hogs and cattle and chickens, the products that end up being exported, also extremely significant for our farmers.
Blake, U.S. has been long considered to have a really distinct advantage in ag trade due to our domestic infrastructure, whether it be rivers or rail and highways. But other countries are going to catch up with us eventually. Could you help us explain what gives the U.S. that advantage, and what do you see as far as future infrastructure improvements are going to be needed to keep that transportation and freight advantage for our American growers?
Absolutely. So we hit a little bit on the U.S. barge system, which is without question one of the most efficient global forms of transportation for grains to get to the port down in New Orleans and get out to customers. And I do think we were so dominant in front of that maybe we fell behind, and now we're starting to see more reinvestment into the river. There's a huge project going on with the locks and dams to invest money into them and get them back, up to a better condition and rate of speed and everything. So, we are investing in those, great efficient forms of transportation on the river. There are projects ongoing, investments ongoing. What do we need to do? I think the precision railroad is really going to continue to change how we think about the speed in which we can get things from A to B. You look at in the eastern part of the belt where we're more kind of shifted in our company with our assets. If you can speed up when we can get something from an elevator to a southeast port, for example, then the need to look at investments and how quick you can load a boat and get it out, it becomes much more easy and much more simple. So as we make those changes and cut down on that lag time from when something gets loaded into a train to when it gets to port, then the investment keeps coming and it just gets more exciting and much more efficient and easier to serve our customers at certain destinations. So it's kind of a process, in my opinion, but the infrastructure and the transportation is absolutely key and critical of where we have a competitive advantage globally, and something that I see continuing to stay in front of and not fall behind with some of the recent investments that we've seen.
I know Ben gave me the 5-minute warning here a little bit ago. I just want to give a general question to wrap up, and then we'll take questions from our attendees. And I guess I'll start with Allison. What one thing are you looking forward to in this next generation as it relates to agricultural trade? A lot of people, young men and women, are taking over their family operations as baby boomers are retiring out. So what do you see as the future, and give us your perspective?
Sure. So I don't want to speak on behalf of all millennials, but I am a millennial. So I do think that there's a changing tide and a lot of opportunity for technology. I think millennials approach things like biotech very differently than generations that came before us. So I see so much opportunity for technologies that we can embrace at the field level, which is primarily the work that I do on a daily basis. So things like gene editing, things like biotech, things like crop protection, and where that converges with technologies in precision ag or even further down the supply chain, I think we're at a real sweet spot where all of that is coming together. And it makes me really excited for not just farmers' ability to adopt things and to adjust and to really be an answer to climate change, but I think for younger people to be really excited about agriculture, which has traditionally been a very mature industry, but has a lot of opportunity to be a use case for not only how to use these technologies, but to do it in a way that does serve the greater good. So on behalf of millennials, I think there's some great hope out there, and I'm really excited about what exists in ag for all of that to come together.
Thanks. I guess I'll go maybe in order of age. I'm going to go, Blake, what do you see as the future of agriculture as it relates to trade?
Yeah, I think the carbon the carbon footprint that we talked about, that Kurt, I think, brought up, I think is really, really important. You know, we have a brand new ethanol plant in Colwich, Kansas, and our carbon, our CI score, we call it, is extremely critical and something every month. How can we get, you know, more efficient and get better at that? So I see the carbon side that, you know, Allison also mentioned of sustainability and thinking about things differently is a big piece of the future for sure.
Okay, Kirk, give us the wise words. What do you see and what are you excited about as far as the future of agricultural trade in this next generation?
What are you saying, Mike? I'm not a millennial?
I know you're not. You're right there with me as a boomer. Okay, boomer.
Hey, I have the gray hair. I'm not sure I have the wisdom. A couple of thoughts. I would agree entirely with what Allison and Blake have said. I think the willingness to embrace technology, the willingness to implement new ideas. I'm very optimistic. When I interact with the next generation of farmers, I'm very optimistic about the future. I think the other thing I would add is that the younger farmers that I interact with, I'm also impressed with their business acumen and their aggressiveness. And I think that's extremely important in maintaining and building these international markets that we're talking about. Really a willingness to embrace that. I really sense among the next generation, you know, a willingness to really assert the opportunities, to take advantage of those opportunities. I think I'm very optimistic.
On behalf of OSU Extension educators across the state of Ohio, I know working with Kirk and people with like at the Andersons and Allison, the work you do internationally, we do appreciate the work you do, and we thank you for the time you spent with us today. So I'll turn it over to Ben.
Thank you, Mike, and thank you to all of our speakers and presenters today. We really appreciate you taking the time to be with us.